Okay, our numbers are still going up, but I'm just going to get started with a little bit of an introduction. My name is Lauren Fox. I'm the Senior Director of Policy at the Public School Forum of North Carolina. And on behalf of the forum, as well as our partners, the Samuel Du Bois Cook Center on Social Equity and the Center for Child and Family Policy, both at Duke University, I'm very excited to welcome you to week 2 of the virtual Color of Education Summit for 2020. Hopefully many of you were able to join us last week on Friday for our kickoff session with Keisha Bentley Edwards, Sandy Darity, and Danita Mason Hoggins, who discussed racial wealth and health disparities and the impact on racial equity in education. If you missed that session, the recording was shared with you earlier today via email, and it's also available on Eventbrite, so you all can access that then, and we highly recommend that you check out that really engaging discussion. So I'd like to start today by giving you all an opportunity to introduce yourselves to us, to the panelists, and to each other. So if you could just take a minute in the chat to please share your name, your organization, or your role, and why you've decided to attend Color of Education. So while you're introducing yourselves, I want to take a moment to thank our Color of Education supporters. You can see all of their names here, and I'd like to give a special shout out to our presenting sponsors, Participate Learning, and the Boroughs Welcome Fund. We're so grateful to them for all of their support and for helping to make these events possible. So I see some people beginning to add their names and information into the chat. Just a reminder, share your name, your organization or role, and why you're attending Color of Education this year. It's really great to see all of you. We're so excited that we have so many folks joining us from around the state this year, and we're very inspired to see those who hold different positions related to education who really want to dig in deep and have the honest and critical conversations about race and education that are so necessary in order for us to take steps to dismantle systemic racism in our schools. So we're very grateful to all of you for being here and engaging with us. I want to remind you all that after today, we have 2 more weeks of Color of Education. Next Tuesday, October 20th, we'll be discussing policing and schools. And then Tuesday, October 27th, we'll have our final session, which will be on racial inequity in North Carolina schools, where we've been, where we are, and where we go from here. So you'll receive more details on those via email, just like you did today. And even though we're not able to be together in person, we really want these sessions to be engaging. So please join the conversation. You can use #ColorOfEducation on Twitter, and you can find all of our different partner organizations at the handles on the screen there. We also want you to feel free to submit questions for the panelists today through the Q&A box in Zoom. And please feel free to use the chat throughout the conversation to share your reflections, but we'll ask that you keep your questions to the Q&A to make sure that we don't miss anything as we're going along. We'll also be adding some discussion questions for you all in the chat that you can respond to engage with each other. So today's session will begin with a panel with education leaders and policymakers on the impact of COVID-19 on racial equity in education. And I'll introduce them to you in just a moment. But I want to let you know about what we'll do after this first session. We'll have the choice of 2 breakout sessions that you can attend. The first on whole child impacts of COVID-19 will take place in this same Zoom webinar that we're in right now. So you can just stay here if that's the session that you're choosing to attend. We also have a breakout on early childhood and policy implications related to COVID-19 and racial equity. So if you want to attend that session, we will share the link in the chat, and you also received it via email earlier today. So without further ado, I want to now introduce our very esteemed panelists who I'm honored to be with today. First, I want to note that Keisha Clemens, the 2020 Wells Fargo Principal of the Year, unfortunately is unable to join us today, and we will miss her very much. We send her our bests. Now I will introduce Senator Valerie Foushee, who you see on your screen there. Valerie is a lifelong resident of Orange County, North Carolina, and she's been a North Carolina Senator representing District 23 since 2013. James Ford is the Executive Director of the Center for Racial Equity in Education, also known as CREED, and James is the Principal Consultant at Filling the Gap Educational Consultants. He also currently serves as a member of the North Carolina State Board of Education representing the Southwest region. Dr. Maria Rosa Rangel has over 25 years of experience in education, and she currently serves as the Director for Family and Community Engagement in the Office of Equity Affairs in the Wake County Public School District. And Matt Bristow Smith is a 2019 Wells Fargo, North Carolina Principal of the Year, and he has served as principal of Edgecombe Early College High School since 2014. Thank you all so much for being here today. So I'm going to start by asking you all to take about 3 minutes to share a bit more about your current work and answer the question, in your experience, what are the most notable ways in which COVID-19 has impacted racial inequities in education? And as you all are talking, I would also ask the attendees to share in the chat their reflections to that same question about what you all have learned, observed, or experienced in your schools and communities with regards to COVID-19 and racial equity. So let's start with Senator Fushi.
Thank you, Lauren, and thank you for this opportunity to share with everyone today. Of course, as you have indicated in your introduction, I serve in the North Carolina Senate, and in the Senate, I serve on the Ed and Higher Education Committee, as well as the Committee on Health and Human Services. So I see my role as a legislator, linked with education and health. And so I think what we've learned over this long 7 months is that as it relates to COVID-19, African-American children have been impacted in ways that other children may not have been, not just African-American children, but also students who are disadvantaged as it relates to economics. And so what we know almost immediately when school children across the state were not able to receive in-person instruction is we saw how this situation has exacerbated the digital divide, that so many students, particularly students of color, and students who live in rural communities did not have the ability to join their peer students in the classroom, and having to leave their home in many situations to have accessibility to high-speed internet. And I think another thing that we see in this situation, when you consider who was deemed essential workers, many of those are low-wage earners who are not able to remain at home and assist their children with instruction. So these are children without adult supervision as they try to learn on the same plane as other students. And one of the things that has been most painful for me to watch and hear about is the lack of nutrition services for these same students, many of whom relied on being in school to receive at least 2 meals per day. Removing them from that situation where they no longer had access, and even today in many situations with the new school year, not having access to nutrition. What we've heard as it relates to all students, but I believe it's probably more impactful for African-American students, is what we know about the anxiety that students are experiencing during this time. And for African-American students, hearing on a regular basis how the virus disproportionately affects African-American families and Latinx families, but with a higher death rate as it relates to African-American families. Imagine these children are seeing their grandparents, aunts, uncles, and in many cases, their parents succumb to this virus. I could go on, but I think my 3 minutes are probably up. But you know, not having access to after school enrichment programs that many of these children took advantage. All of these things are no longer available. So I'll stop there and yield to my fellow panelists.
Thank you so much. Matt, I'll go to you next. Oh, you're on mute, Matt.
Yep, I promised I was not going to have my mute challenge, and I did anyway. So look, I think Senator Foushee touched on a lot of the realities that that students of color have faced in my area, Edgecombe County, where I've worked for 23 years. I'd like to just share a little bit about Edgecombe County for our listeners. We're a Tier 1 high poverty rural context. The forum's roadmap of need places Edgecombe County at 95 out of 100 counties in those 4 key areas: education, economic development, healthcare, and crime. You know, in Edgecombe County, we know a little about natural disasters, having weathered several 500-year floods in the last 20 years. And dealing with adversity and inequity is sort of baked into the history and culture of Edgecombe. We're the home of Princeville, the oldest town in America chartered by free slaves. And our school system has 6,000 students, 70% of whom are learners of color, all of whom we love and we care about deeply, and we feel that our futures are inextricably woven with theirs. I say all this to say that prior to COVID, we were already in the middle of disrupting the way we do school in Edgecombe. We care deeply enough about our scholars that we're rethinking the way we do school. We're deeply involved in the Restart school transformation process. Opportunity culture. We have a dual language immersion school. We're knee deep in developing our talent pipeline for teachers and for principals. We've even redesigned our O-chart at central office to include a director of innovation who is guiding a lot of this work. So we're so committed up and down our organization prior to COVID to breathing hope into the school system and to the school experience for kids. And then in the midst of this innovation and this rethinking about how we do school, we get COVID, which once again has made us rethink nearly everything that we do. It's called out in sharp relief the haves and the have-nots, the privileged and the less so, and the inequities that continue to persist, particularly along racial and economic lines. So, you know, we know that those forces shape the school and the life experiences of our scholars. Senator Foushee spoke to that very candidly. Edgecombe's a community I love. These are students I love. COVID has hit our students of color disproportionately than our Caucasian students, and that has hurt us, and it has made us rethink once again how to design the school experience, particularly in remote learning, from the margins. So I look forward to sharing some of our experiences today, learning from our panelists. And Lauren, thank you for letting us bring our voice to this conversation.
Thank you so much. James, I'll go to you next. I saw you nodding.
Yeah, you'll see that often when Matt starts talking. You know, so I'd like to think that I wear a couple of hats. So as the executive director of CREED, or the Center for Racial Equity in Education, I would like to think that we kind of, through our research that came out last year, Erasing Inequities, kind of spelled out in no uncertain terms the quantitative influence that race has on opportunity structures in education. And so, you know, to an extent, I think what COVID has done is it has revealed, to use a medical term, the pre-existing condition of systemic racism. But I think even to those who haven't paid attention to sort of the data arguments, what this did is it illustrated in real human terms the ways that systemic inequality that is animated through along racial lines robs people of opportunity. And it's done so in ways that are spelled out, you know, when we see the families who have been most likely to start remotely or online have been Black and Latinx families. And conversely, they're the same families who have been most disadvantaged by the system. And so it really shows that the way oppression works is that there is no good solution to it, right? When the winds come, often the populations of the margins are the ones who suffer the worst. On the other hand, I would say from a state board standpoint, and Matt has been involved with some of this work on the strategic planning committee, we were already beginning some of the conversations very forthrightly. And if I could say, it's been somewhat new territory to speak with such precision around issues of race. And so right smack dab in the middle of these conversations and, just passing the adoption of a new strategic plan and beginning to talk about equity and adopt that definition, we see COVID come. And it just absolutely cuts across, in no uncertain terms, racial lines. And it has robbed the communities that we're talking about, not just educationally, but at every turn. As Senator Fushi mentioned, those who are most likely to contract the virus are Black and brown. Those who are most likely to die from the virus are Black and brown. Those who don't have the buoy of wealth to help them, to buffer them from the windfalls of this are Black and brown. And so if nothing else, I think it just lays out the case in ways that really are kind of almost eerie when you consider, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, the resurgence of the movement for Black lives. The racism continues to be that hound of hell, as Dr. King said, that continues to dog us, and something we're going to have to deal with if we intend on having a republic, but furthermore, if we intend on having an effective school system.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Damn.
Maria Rosa, I'll go to you next. You're still muted, Maria Rosa.
Okay, how about now? Can you hear me?
Good.
Well, I wear different hats also, and I have been in contact with different leaders across North Carolina and basically just talk to them about what they see. And as far as family engagement, because that's what I do for a living, I know that, and these leaders also know that COVID-19 has really amplified family engagement inequities, right? They existed before, but COVID has really forced us to take a deep understanding of the barriers that COVID-19 has imposed on our community. When we're talking about families, I mean, the ones that got hit the hardest are the families that need us the most, the marginalized families, low-income families, immigrant families, refugee families, families with special ed students, families that have students their English is not even their first language. So when you think about all these challenges and barriers that has really forced us to take a deeper understanding, I mean, think about it, access to digital device, right? The haves and the have-nots. And what did we see? We saw and we are seeing families that have access to technology. But also we know that it forced schools to really take initiatives to make sure that all students have a device, whether it's a tablet, a laptop, or a Chromebook. However, we still see inequities across North Carolina where we see some students that still don't have a device or don't have access to connectivity, internet. So then when you think about also the different platforms that families need to, all of a sudden they need to understand so they could support their kids better. And then too, we take for granted that some families, they're not strong in technology. So all of a sudden, they have to learn all this, how to navigate the different platforms, how to troubleshoot all these different technology issues that could happen, right, when you're trying to connect. So it have forced our families to take I guess, the initiative and also to take the role of a teacher. And sometimes families are equipped to do so and some are not, especially when technology is not your strong suit, or even the English language is not your strong suit. And then too, when we think about these families that have been hit the hardest, those are also the families that are working. They are the essential workers. So, and then too, when you think about just communication, the way all this information is coming down the tunnel, right? How it works, if you have email, you get the information. If you updated your latest telephone number, then you'll get a text, or you get the phone call if you have prescribed to school messenger. But even if you do all those things, there's families that still cannot access the information because English is not their first language. So, I feel that the inequities are so amplified But I think that it also has opportunities to transform and for us to think outside the box, right? For example, I oversee family academies for Wake County Public Schools. And when COVID hit, right, and communication was chaos, I started thinking, and it forced me and my team to think about how can we better and how can we get to those families that need us the most. So we started thinking about, okay, what is it that they all are good at? Facebook, we take it for granted, but Facebook is an easy way for us to communicate. So we started to, revive our Facebook page, and all of a sudden we were sharing resources, we were sharing strategies, we were sharing information that was coming from the district and other areas, so the families will feel at least informed and have the information that they needed. So I know that we don't need to pity these families. But what these families really need from us right now is our support. And we have to think outside the box. We have to think about what is it that they need. And, we have to be intentional. And intentional means you have to take the initiative. We just cannot be lip service. We have to act because family need us. And if we support these families, they're going to support their children. That's what they want. I'm a parent, and believe me, I'm educated, but I'm still struggling with all these different things coming, right? How to navigate these different platforms? How do I support my child? What about the mental well-being of my child? So I think about these families too, and I think about they also need support with that. So again, you have to think outside the box and think about how can I get to these families and really, really be intentional.
Absolutely. And we're going to come back to hear a little bit more about that and what you recommend a little bit later. So we talk about, what you all have said has really gotten me thinking about the systemic racism that we know is built into our society and in our public policies, and that COVID-19 has only brought those things to light and exacerbated the inequities that were already existing, right? So I want to turn to our policymakers, James Ford and Senator Foushee, to address this next question. So this past year has been notable not only because of the global pandemic, but also because of the progress that we've seen with regards to the Leandro court case in North Carolina. And I think we can link to some resources for those of you who want to learn more about that case. Recently, we had the Leandro report that was released by Wested and a ruling by Judge David Lee, both that said that North Carolina is not providing the resources necessary for every child to receive a sound basic education, and that students of color are disproportionately impacted by that. This was pre-COVID, right? So could the two of you talk a little bit about the links between Leandro, racial equity, and what we see now in light of COVID-19, as well as how you think as policymakers the state should move forward? So I'll go to James first for that question.
Sure. So I think it should be stated for the record that although Leandro has never been an expressly race-conscious document, it's virtually impossible to disassociate, economic disadvantage or socioeconomics from race, just because of the way our, society has been structured. The hierarchy is racialized. So even when you look at the original counties, right, that filed that suit, and then, the urban centers that, later joined, they serve a significant population of students of color, not only Black, but Latinx, emerging Latinx populations, and Native populations as well. So I just kind of wanted to state that. But because of that, a lot of folks look at, the Wested report, and they say that they maybe didn't see race as prominently as they would have liked. I did. I saw race featured in that document. Whether you look at the section that dealt with the need for qualified teachers, and the need for teachers of color, right, citing the evidence of the impact that having teachers of color have in the classroom, the lack of access to effective teachers that students of color don't enjoy, and then the need for good PD that really focuses on culturally and linguistically responsive, techniques, and then even looking at the composition of the high poverty schools themselves. There's huge intersections. You're talking about a racial equity document, whether or not we say that. Part of what I think we have to do is begin to do that ourselves, right? To cast that narrative, to not talk about racial equity as separate from the Leandro case, as central to the Leandro case. Because like I said, just because our wealth and access is structured, we're talking about overwhelmingly kids of color, even if not exclusively. And so, in our response as a state board and how we deal with that, there are several things, of course, that, and I've been on the program talking about what we've done to help respond to that, particularly the need to increase teachers of color. That's a part of our strategic planning, document. More culturally responsive educators, better access to PD, educators of color in the principal pipeline as well. But if I could kind of editorialize, there are things that I would like to add on top of that. I think that what the governor has done in suggesting that teaching fellows be expanded to HBCUs and minority serving institutions is a huge first step, and one that conforms with Leandro. But ultimately, I think that racial equity is something we're going to have to hold ourselves accountable for, beyond sort of the No Child Left Behind and Every Student Succeeds Act. But, if I see a school that's an A or B school, allegedly, but where kids of color, Black, Latinx, Native American, mixed race, Southeast Asian students are not performing highly, that's not a high performing school. I don't care what anybody says. And until we put sort of the accountability measures in place to start calling those things out where there are disparities across racial and ethnic lines and beginning to grade schools and districts and hold them accountable to that, I just don't see us moving forward from that. But to me, those sort of provisions are, and those policy orientations are tethered with what could be Leandro responsive approaches.
Thank you so much. Senator Fushi, I'll turn it over to you.
So I couldn't agree with James more, and it's hard to add to that. But what I would say is that what we know now is that it's paramount that we focus on pre-K opportunities. If we're going to ever talk about how we really move forward with leveling the playing field, it has to start at pre-K. That should go without saying. And so, as it relates to placing A through F grades on schools and announcing schools as failing, that does something to the psyche, not just teachers who may not want to come to a school that they know is already failing, that they know that the funding is not what it is in other districts, that they know that those school districts are not held in the same regard. So they go where the opportunities exist in other areas. So you have that going on. You have students not feeling that they measure up to their peers in other schools. You know that you need good teachers in the classroom. You know that you need good principals. You know that you need a situation where the community has the same involvement as those building leaders who want to see those students succeed. If we know that the funding system, and trust me, I was on a task force at the General Assembly that was earmarked to look at our funding formulas and determine how we change that so that there is a more equitable distribution of funds to these schools. That task force was stopped after maybe 3 meetings. So we know that our system, our funding system, does not lead to equitable distributions of funds to our several districts. So if we could just get that and understand, as James talked about, these pre-existing conditions that racism has always fabricated through our system, then that's how we start. But if we don't start at pre-K, if we don't start at early education, then we have no chance of making these students successful and putting them in a situation whereby they're not just able to compete with their peers, but they're able to compete with students, not just in this state, but globally.
Well, you all are setting up our breakout sessions just perfectly with all the talk about early childhood as well as whole child support. So thank you for that. I'm going to go back to Maria Rosa now. You talked a bit, Maria Rosa, about the communication with families during this time and some ideas about how schools and districts can improve on that. But could you go into a little bit more depth there, and maybe specifically for our immigrant families and those who don't speak English at home?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I was like Speedy Gonzalez going to town. I just have so much to say. And so, yes, I mean, when you think about the inequities and you think about Latinx families, you think about communications and how can we make sure that whatever the district is putting out there it's written in Spanish, right? But also other languages. I think that we need to stop and think that this is no longer a black and white state. It's a very tricolor state. I mean, in Wake County, we have over 323 different languages represented. So I know that across North Carolina, there's also other families that they need the support of communication. And I think that what we need to emphasize with families is that they need to update their information so that we have access to a phone number that is workable so we could send text messages, right? But I think that one of the strategies that I would have on the table is that we need to be intentional, right? And we need to send a message to families and let them know that please provide us with your latest phone number. But also we need to make sure that they have what they need. We need to intentionally reach out to the families, and every school knows who those families are. Every principal knows who those families are. And we need to utilize resources. You know, we have to reach out to central services. We need to reach out to teachers, social workers, counselors. We need to work together, but also we need to tap into the community and find those communication brokers, those cultural brokers to help us reach those families that if you don't have someone that look like that, then reach out to the community. You know, with the food insecurities, I mean, everybody was forced to think outside the box and create those connections with the community so that we could make sure that our kids were being and are still being fed, right? Because that is first priority, food. And I mean, I have so many strategies that I want to share that I would actually, I could send you a link of all the different strategies, but you have to think outside the box. But also, you need to know your demographics because that's going to drive the strategies that you need to put in place so that you could support them.
Thank you so much. I love that you talked about drawing on the assets in the community, and that leads me very well to my next question, which goes to Matt. So we often talk about racial equity in relation to urban schools, but many of our students of color in North Carolina live in rural communities. So could you talk about what you see in your district in Edgecombe, both in terms of challenges and assets?
Sure. And look, you know, I think James hit it the nail on the head when he says, you know, the intersection of, you know, economics, socioeconomics, and race. You know, these are not things that we can discuss separately. These are things we have to discuss together. And, you know, the truth is, you know, the lion's share of all of our tier 1 counties in North Carolina are east of the I-95 corridor. Not all, but most of them. And that means when school is done right, you know, it serves an even more critical role for our rural families and our families of color, providing, you know, many of our students 2 of their 3 daily meals, you know, services for students with disabilities, language supports for our ELL learners, not to mention school cultures that provide like strong relationships, high expectations, high levels of support for each and every individual student's needs. And so, you know, that to me is like the baseline for what a high quality education ought to look like in every school in North Carolina. But the greater challenge, and this is the greater challenge for communities that serve students of color in high populations like we do in Edgecombe, is to co-design the K-12 experience in which scholars of color, they see themselves in the school experience, where the school experience is it's a journey of identity and self-discovery for students of color, scholars of color, you know, just like it might be for white scholars, you know, where historically rooted institutional distrust is disrupted because the institutions themselves are committed to change. And so in Edgecombe, you know, I see so many assets that have contributed to a community that is, you know, actively working to try to lift up all scholars as our most precious resource, and looking at their work, at our work through, you know, an equity lens at every single level. And I think, you know, perhaps the most important of these resources in Edgecombe that is driving that work is this coalescence of really strong leaders of color who reflect the community they serve. Thinking about this out loud, our former and current Board of Education chairs, Evelyn Wilson and Raymond Privet, both leaders of color and educators widely respected in our community. Our superintendent, Dr. Valerie Bridges, both of our assistant superintendents, leaders of color, our county sheriff, Clee Atkinson, our community college president, Greg McLeod, our board of commissioners chair, Leonard Wiggins, our county manager, Eric Evans, Princeville mayor, Bobby Jones, all educators connected with the community, leaders of color, and they set the tone in our community for the work that we do. They get along well together. They have shared sense of values. I don't think that they get enough credit, in my opinion, for setting the conditions to create institutions that engage in self-examination, that hire staff and initiatives that support the values. They allocate limited resources where they're most needed, and they show up. I mean, I think half the battle is that you show up for their community and for kids. That's before, during, and after the pandemic. So I think one of the things that I see in Edgecombe as a district that is committed to transformation, but also committed to co-designing the school experience with kids, is that leadership matters, and not just leadership in the school building, but leadership in these community organizations, these community institutions, many of which, and upon reflection, like most of which, are led by incredible leaders of color in our community. And I just think that matters.
Absolutely. Thank you. I think we may have lost Maria Rosa, but hopefully she'll be able to get back in. Before I ask my final question, I want to remind everyone in the audience to submit any questions that you have to for the panelists in our Q&A box, and we'll go to that right after this next question. So my final question, I'm going to limit you all to one response, which I think is probably going to be a bit of a challenge, knowing all of you. But thinking about the advice that you would give to policymakers, educators, and others who are working to address racial inequities that have been spotlighted and exacerbated as a result of COVID, what is one action step that you would recommend to be taken now, whether it's something that we do through policy, practice, or individual or collective action? So I'll start first with Maria Rosa.
I have so many. So I think one of them will be for school districts to create a center for families to go for any kind of services, right? Whether it's language, whether it's technology, whether it's food, whether it's whatever resource, but for them to know that there is a place for them within the school that they could go and somebody will provide them with some sort of assistance. So we need more funding for that. We need more funding for family engagement, coordinators, directors, all over North Carolina, not just in wealthy school districts.
Thank you. James.
So I'm going to cheat a little bit and kind of answer one thing that I'm happy that we've done. So just last week in our planning and work session, as we concluded, the state board provided for the creation of an equity office for the state, which would be initially housed sort of under the leadership of Dr. David Stegall and eventually built out with an equity officer for the state. And I think that's a huge thing, to sort of, create stations and suites within government to oversee this work and to hold, us as a state accountable for doing that. And the other thing I would just say is, from every policymaker, lawmaker, is the general ethos, or like a motto to live by, and that is to make racism illegal. Literally start thinking about that. How do we make it unlawful for these sort of inequities to persist, and not just as something that is morally or ethically good to have, but something that should actually be deemed illegal, and building the structures in place to ensure that happens.
Do you have an example of a policy proposal to do that, James?
You're asking me to get into my platform, and I'm not running, but I just think that when we see manifestations of disparate impact, be they intentional or not, those things, you know, that there has to be accountability for those things. That's what I would say, generally speaking. I don't have a specific policy in mind, but that's kind of the frame that I'm looking at stuff through.
That's great. And hopefully this equity office could help to think that through. I'll go to Senator Fushi next.
I'm glad you put me behind James, because if he can cheat, I can cheat. So I'm going to give two things. One is expand access to high-speed internet across the state of North Carolina. And number two, the legislature needs to fully fund the $427 million that it needs to implement the settlement for the Leandro decision.
Thank you. Matt.
You know, Lauren, coming behind James, coming behind Senator Fushi, like I'm just going to, I'm going to jump right in. Like every system is designed perfectly to get the results it gets. So I think we have to acknowledge that we are all part of a system, and that decisions we make at every level of that system have equity implications, and they impact scholars and they impact families of color. For example, when we alter our North Carolina Constitution and we put a 7% cap on state income taxes, and when we put this to the voters to decide, we limit our available resources to serve the public good. And it's not lost on me that that West Ed report places North Carolina behind in education funding to the tune of $1 billion a year for the next 8 years. So I wonder, you know, when James talks about racism and making it illegal, I wonder how many of our voters, and first off, I don't know why we would put moral decisions in front of a voter, okay? Like, I just don't think that we vote on moral decisions. But I wonder how many of our voters would have been in favor of that 7% tax cap if the ballot language had said something like, do you vote to reduce funds we need to meet our constitutional obligations to provide a sound basic education for every child of color in every zip code of our state? Like, if we had phrased the question that way, do you vote to reduce the available funds we have to serve our students of color in our state? I wonder how many of our North Carolinians would have voted for that. But instead, we voted to reduce taxes, and no one ever votes to raise taxes. I mean, just nobody ever does that. And so my advice to policymakers, in particular legislators, is to always do what's best for students, and always, in particular, what's best for students of color. Like, ask yourself, make that your litmus test, make that your sniff test. How does this policy impact students of color in North Carolina? I don't think that's unreasonable given the historical inequities that are so well documented. And McCall spoke to our state board just this past week. Let that guide the systems that we design.
Absolutely. And we have people like James doing research to help us see what those inequities are, and maybe, you know, having that accountability built in so that it's impossible to not know how different policies impact students of color would be a step in the right direction. Thank you all so much. So now I'm going to go to a few questions from our attendees. So the first one is thoughts on the idea of creating more state agencies or increasing the capacity of existing state agencies to take over some of the things that schools have been dealing with due to COVID. So in other words, should we be expecting schools to be the ones to provide meals to students in these circumstances, or should it be a different state agency? Should schools be the ones that are addressing internet home access, or should it be a different state agency? So anyone could respond to that. I don't know if Senator Fushi or James want to take the lead, but feel free to jump in.
I'll take a stab at it. Certainly, I think that to have an expectation that the schools provide all of these wraparound services without adequate funding makes no sense. And so what we've seen with COVID is those extra bursts of funding that went out in order to ensure that schools could provide those services as it relates to meals, as it relates to hotspots. That was a situation that called for additional resources, and those resources were put there because there was federal funding to assist with that. But I think moving forward, we should have learned that these are not situations that we should expect individual school districts to handle without adequate resources, without adequate supervision, without the adequate supports from other state agencies.
Yeah, just briefly, with the funding disparities that exist from, you know, your smallest and rural counties to your larger urban ones, it's a lot to expect school district staff to shoulder that burden. That being said, you know, my political philosophy is that, you know, we should have a stronger safety net, and that, you know, that responsibility should be more diffuse and spread out across agencies from the state. And the, you know, frankly, you know, policy created a lot of the inequities we're talking about. And so therefore the responsibility to help mitigate those should fall within the policymaking bodies as well.
Thank you. Maria Rosa or Matt, do you want to respond to that question?
So I would just say that one of the things that is unique about schools is that they are intimately engaged with families and with students, and that if you're looking for an institution that is well positioned to provide direct services to kids and to families, schools are one of those institutions that are, you know, uniquely formed to do that. So while I don't want to add, you know, one more thing to every school to have to manage, on the other hand, these are the direct responsibilities of schools. If we make a commitment as a state board 4 years ago to a whole child initiative, or we made a commitment last month to an equity initiative, those, like, the idea that school is just about learning is honestly, like, I'm just going to say it, like, that is a racist philosophy. Okay, that school is just about learning. School is about so much more than learning. And if we narrow the focus of schools to just say we're really just focused on academics, then we are so not serving students who need school to actually be more than that for them.
Wow, thank you.
I just want to add that, again, I go back to the community and aligning some of the services with some of the agencies so that we could be able to really capitalize on the needs of those families. Because what happens a lot of times, the same families that we see in our schools are the same families that they're also dealing with the different organizations and agencies. So by us aligning those services, we're able to meet the needs of those families, but together, right? Joining forces together.
Great, thank you. This next question is for Matt, and then if others want to chime in with other ideas as well. Matt, you mentioned redesigning Edgecombe County so that scholars of color can see themselves and identify themselves. How did you do this in Edgecombe, and can you provide some examples? And then if others have examples that they've seen elsewhere, feel free to add your thoughts after Matt.
Yeah, and so let me just say that, like, Matt Smith didn't do that. This is more of like a commitment that Edgecombe County has made, that our leadership has made, our building level principals have made, and our teachers have made. And once you make that commitment, individual strategies, you know, just kind of fall in where they need to be. I will say that, like, we've had some whole school transformations that have occurred in Edgecombe. We have a highly successful restart model that's happening on the north side of our county in Coker-Wimberley and Phillips and in North Edgecombe, led by really innovative leaders, some of whom are Teach for America, some of whom are Northeast Leadership Academy graduates, one of whom, Donnell Cannon, spoke to the state board last November at our fall planning and work session in 2019. The commitment that we've made is to not just design the work we do for the middle, but to design for the margins. And the call that Donnell made to the state board was, we have 1.6 million students in North Carolina, but the commitment, like, when equity is living in a school and when equity is living in a school system, you design for the one. You ask yourself, how do these systems, how do these practices, how do these policies, how they impact one student? Use those kids in the margins as your litmus test for whether your system and your processes are equitable. So I would say the Restart model is a place there. We also have a dual language immersion school that has been fantastic for bringing students into our school who are second language learners and trying to build their capacity to become bilingual by the time they're third grade. We are actively recruiting and trying to develop our teacher pipeline when it comes to teachers and leaders of color. And I think that's really critical. And there are 1,000 other ways that once you make that commitment to co-design school with kids, look, at the very least, as a building level principal, I work with my teachers to make sure they incorporate voice and choice into their lessons so that students actually have the role of getting in the driver's seat of their learning and developing their sense of agency and their sense of self-efficacy. If we don't build the kids' muscle for that while they're in high school, when they graduate, they've never had to make a choice that's relevant to their life, much less their learning. So like there's so many ways that we can actually do that once you make the commitment to it.
Thank you so much. Does anybody else want to add anything to what Matt just shared? Guess you just left everybody speechless, Matt. Well, I just want to thank you all so very much for joining us today. I can't believe my good luck that I got to moderate this panel. And I think that you gave everyone who's in attendance some sort of action items to think about. And I saw some mentions of what everyone is going to do in their own schools or their own communities to address racial equity in education in light of COVID. So I'm grateful to all of you for joining us.